Captain Ian Hayes had been flying his small exploration ship through the vast emptiness of space for days. His mission was simple: explore a newly discovered planet on the edge of the galaxy. But nothing had gone according to plan. One minute, he was cruising smoothly through space, and the next, a sudden wave of cosmic energy struck his ship, throwing it off course. The crash was violent. Ian fought to keep control of the ship, but the damage was too much. The last thing he remembered before everything went black was the howling sound of metal scraping against rock. When Ian woke up, everything around him was still. His head throbbed with pain, but he forced himself to sit up. Looking out the broken window, he saw the alien landscape that stretched endlessly before him. Snow-covered mountains, thick clouds hanging low in the sky, and the sharp, icy winds that screamed through the cracks in the ship's hull. He was on a planet with temperatures so low it felt like the air itself was frozen. "Great," Ian muttered to himself, his breath fogging up in the cold air. "Just great." He checked his surroundings. The ship was half buried in a snowdrift, its engines fried, and the control panels were sparking with dead electricity. The damage was severe, and there was no way he could fix it without help. He knew he couldn't stay in the wreckage for long. The cold would kill him in hours. He needed to find shelter, fast. After checking his emergency supplies, Ian grabbed his survival pack, which contained a thermal suit, a med kit, and a small amount of food and water. The ship's radar was offline, but he could still make out a few faint signals through his communicator. Something, or someone, was out there. He couldn't be the only one who had crashed. With little choice, Ian set off across the frozen landscape, hoping to find any sign of life. His thermal suit kept him warm, but the cold was relentless. The bitter wind cut through the layers of his clothing, and the ground underfoot was slick with ice. He stumbled several times but kept pushing forward, driven by the thought of finding shelter. Hours later, Ian spotted something in the distance. A shadow, large and imposing, loomed against the horizon. He squinted, barely able to see through the swirling snow. But it was unmistakable. A ship. Not human, though. This was something different. The sleek design of the vessel was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was alien, unmistakably so, but it was grounded just as his ship had been. Ian moved closer, his curiosity growing stronger than the fear creeping up his spine. His boots crunched through the thick snow as he approached the wreckage. His heart raced as he circled the ship, trying to find an entrance. It was clear the ship had crash-landed too. There were no signs of life outside, but the structure seemed intact enough to provide some shelter. As Ian cautiously climbed into the alien craft, the temperature inside was shockingly warmer. But that sense of relief quickly disappeared when he saw her. The alien queen sat slumped against the wall of the cockpit, her body glowing faintly with bioluminescent markings. Her skin was a translucent shade of pale blue, and she had the elegant, regal appearance of someone who commanded attention. Yet her eyes were closed, and her breathing was slow, as though she were barely clinging to life. Ian's instincts kicked in. He rushed over, checking her pulse. She was alive, but barely. Without thinking, he pulled her into his arms, cradling her carefully. She was heavier than she looked, her body warm despite the coldness around them. "What happened to you?" Ian whispered under his breath, but there was no answer. He knew he had no choice but to try and help her. They were both stranded, and unless they found a way to survive the freezing cold, neither would make it off this planet. Ian's mind raced as he looked around for supplies. There was nothing useful here, but he had to keep moving. The cold was creeping in again, and he couldn't risk staying in the alien ship any longer. He shifted his grip on the queen, and with one final look at the wreckage, he made the difficult decision to leave. There was a cave not far off. He remembered seeing it on his brief scan of the landscape. It was their best chance at survival. With the alien queen still unconscious in his arms, Ian set off, moving quickly through the freezing landscape. The wind howled around him, biting at his skin, but he focused on his goal. survival. For both of them. The cave, he hoped, would offer the warmth they needed. The cave was not much more than a dark, cold shelter from the howling winds. The walls were lined with ice, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and cold rock. Ian set the alien queen down gently on the ground, still unsure of what to do next. Her glowing skin was pale, and her body seemed too still. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. "Come on, stay with me," Ian muttered, more to himself than to the unconscious figure in front of him. He knelt beside her, checking her pulse again. It was slow, but steady. She was alive. Ian knew he had to keep her warm, but he had little more than his own body heat to offer. The survival pack he carried had some emergency blankets, but they would only do so much in the freezing temperatures. He had no choice but to use the one option that seemed both the most obvious and the most awkward. He needed to share his body heat with her. Sighing, Ian removed his thermal jacket and draped it over the queen's body. Then he unzipped his suit and carefully positioned himself beside her, making sure she was covered with the emergency blanket. The heat from his body slowly began to warm her, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. Ian hesitated, then made the decision to press his body against hers, just enough to transfer warmth. He tried not to think about how strange the situation was, how bizarre it was to be sharing heat with a creature who wasn't even human. Her skin was cold to the touch, but as he lay close to her, he could feel her warmth slowly returning. Time seemed to stretch on in the cold cave, the only sounds the howling wind outside and their breathing. Ian couldn't help but notice the strange beauty of the alien queen. Her features were delicate yet sharp, and the soft glow of her skin made her seem almost otherworldly. Her long, dark hair was tangled, and her thin, pointed ears stood out against the pale of her skin. She looked like she belonged to another world entirely, and yet here she was, sharing this tiny frozen space with him. Ian shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position, but every move he made seemed to bring them closer together. The heat from her body, now mixing with his own, created a strange sensation he hadn't expected. It wasn't just warmth. They were both starting to feel the closeness, the physical contact, in a way neither of them had anticipated. After a while, Ian heard a soft groan. His heart skipped a beat. The queen's eyes fluttered open. They were a deep, glowing violet, almost like a strange kind of light pulsing in the dark. She blinked a few times, disoriented, as if she didn't understand where she was. "Where?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. She spoke in a language Ian didn't understand, but her words were soft, laced with confusion. "Hey, it's okay," Ian said, his voice calm. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." The queen looked up at him, her violet eyes scanning his face, confused. Her breathing was faster now, and she seemed more aware of the warmth they were sharing. Her body shifted slightly closer to his, instinctively trying to stay close to the source of heat. Ian couldn't help but notice her reaction. It was subtle but unmistakable. She was drawn to him. She didn't say anything, but her gaze lingered on him, as if she was both uncertain and intrigued by his presence. The strange pull between them wasn't lost on Ian either. He had only known this alien for a short time, but the way she responded to him made him wonder how much of this was survival and how much was something more. "You're lucky I found you," Ian said, trying to ease the awkward tension. "We're both stuck here. Until help arrives, we need to stick together." The queen nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. She was starting to understand, but there was something about the situation that still seemed foreign to her. In her culture, perhaps, there was no need for such close contact. But here, in the cold of this alien world, survival had a way of forcing even the most unusual alliances. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was thick, both of them trying to make sense of what had happened. Ian could feel the pull of her body heat, and he could see the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. She was alive, and that was something to be grateful for. But what came next? They were both stranded on a planet no one knew about. There was no way to contact anyone for help. They were alone together. For now. And as the queen closed her eyes again, her body pressing a little closer to his, Ian realized that survival might require more than just warmth. It might require trust. And trust, it seemed, was the one thing they were both still learning to give. The days in the cave dragged on, each one colder and more challenging than the last. Ian and the alien queen, whom he had learned to call Serana, were forced to rely on each other more than either of them had expected. The cave was small, but it offered some protection from the brutal winds outside. Even so, the temperature remained below freezing, and the threat of the cold was never far away. Serana was still weak from the crash, her energy drained by the ordeal. She would sometimes wake up for short periods, her eyes glowing dimly, but most of the time she rested, recovering from the shock of their crash and the strange circumstances. Ian tried to keep her comfortable, feeding her the small amount of food he had and giving her whatever warmth he could, but he also had to focus on staying alive. Every day, Ian would venture out of the cave, braving the icy wasteland in search of food and supplies. His thermal suit kept him warm for the most part, but the cold was relentless. The winds were cruel, and the frozen ground made it hard to walk. He had to be careful not to get lost in the white landscape, which all looked the same. The only thing he could rely on were the faint, pulsing lights on his compass, which pointed toward a distant mountain range. He found a few small animals, strange, furry creatures that lived in the freezing climate. They were quick and difficult to catch, but Ian was patient. He set traps, built small snares, and eventually, he managed to bring back enough food for both of them. Serana, meanwhile, was starting to regain some of her strength. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, but she was learning to trust Ian. She could see how determined he was, and how much effort he was putting into their survival. Her body had adapted to the cold faster than Ian's, but the longer they were stranded together, the more she felt something strange happening inside her. The heat sharing, the closeness. They had become almost like an anchor for her. It wasn't just about staying warm anymore. It was a craving, a pull that she couldn't explain. Serana had never experienced anything like this before. She had no concept of human emotions, or physical attraction for that matter. Her species didn't feel the same kinds of needs that humans did. But there was something in the way Ian moved, the way his body reacted to hers, that stirred something inside her. It was an unfamiliar sensation, this need to stay close, to be near him. But Serana wasn't sure how to handle these feelings. Her body seemed to want more than just warmth. The sensation grew stronger each day, and she began to notice how much more comfortable she felt with Ian. She would watch him as he moved around the cave, preparing food, checking the small fire they had started, and keeping watch over the entrance. There was something about his presence that brought her comfort, something that made her feel safe in the cold, harsh world outside. Meanwhile, Ian was doing his best to ignore the growing tension between them. He focused on the tasks at hand, keeping the fire going, gathering food, maintaining the shelter. But he couldn't deny the pull he felt towards Serana. He had always been a professional, trained to focus on the mission. But out here, in the freezing cold, with nothing but survival to think about, he began to wonder if their relationship was starting to become something more than just an alliance. He could see how much Serana had changed since they first met. She was no longer the cold, distant queen from the alien ship. She was more human in some ways now, more vulnerable, more in need of connection. Ian knew she wasn't just relying on him for warmth. There was something else in her eyes when she looked at him, something he wasn't ready to admit to himself. The two of them spent hours together in the cave, talking when they could, and simply sharing silence when words failed. They spoke of their worlds, their lives before the crash. Ian learned that Serana's people were a powerful and ancient race, capable of incredible feats of strength and intelligence. But despite their power, they had no concept of the emotions humans took for granted. Love, companionship, even affection, None of it existed in Sirana's world. Still, as the days passed, Sirena seemed to grow more attached to Ian. Every time he returned from hunting, she would greet him with a quiet nod, her eyes glowing softly. She would help him prepare their food, and together they would share what little they had. Ian, for his part, was becoming more protective of her. He couldn't help it. She was the only other person on this cold planet, and in a strange way, they were becoming dependent on each other. He had to admit that the bond between them was growing stronger, whether he wanted it to or not. But as the days dragged on, they both knew that their time here was limited. They couldn't stay in the cave forever. And despite the strange closeness that was developing between them, they both knew that they needed to find a way off this planet, or they would never survive the winter. The days on the frozen planet were beginning to blur together. Ian and Sirana had settled into a routine. He would go out to hunt and gather food while she rested and tried to regain her strength. They worked together to keep the cave warm, and when Ian returned from his hunts, Sirana would greet him with a quiet nod. The bond between them was undeniable, though neither of them fully understood it. But one evening, as Ian was preparing for another long trek outside, something felt different. The air in the cave was growing heavier, and the wind outside had begun to howl more loudly. The sky, once a pale blue, had turned an angry shade of gray, and dark clouds gathered over the horizon. Sirena looked out of the entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the distant mountains. She stood up, her body moving with a strange sense of urgency. "Storm," she said, her voice low and serious. Ian looked at her in surprise. "A storm? It doesn't look that bad." Sirena gave him a hard, knowing look. "Trust me, it's coming." Ian hesitated. He wasn't used to relying on anyone, but the way Sirena spoke made him think she knew what she was talking about. She had experience with harsh environments, and he knew she had already adapted better to the cold than he had. "I'll stay here then," Ian said, grabbing his coat and securing it tightly around his body. "But we need to secure the cave. Get ready for the worst." Sirena nodded and moved quickly around the cave, gathering any loose materials they could use to block the entrance. They had a small fire burning in the center, and they would need to keep it alive during the storm. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly, and even with the cave's shelter, they would need all the warmth they could get. The wind picked up, howling louder with each passing minute. Outside, the snow began to fall in thick, swirling sheets, turning the world outside into a blur of white. Ian could feel the cold creeping into the cave, and he hurried to close off the entrance as best as he could. "How bad is it going to get?" Ian asked, his voice tense as he worked with Sirena to secure the cave. "Very bad," Sirena replied simply, her eyes scanning the outside through a small crack in the cave entrance. "We will need to stay inside for at least a day, maybe more." Ian wasn't sure how they would manage if the storm lasted that long, but he trusted her judgment. Together, they worked quickly, reinforcing the walls and making sure nothing would blow away. The cave, though small, felt like their only refuge now. They had to keep it safe. As the storm raged outside, the temperature inside the cave began to drop. The wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, and snow piled up around the entrance. The small fire they had managed to keep alive flickered, but it wasn't enough to fully ward off the cold. They huddled close to the fire, wrapping themselves in blankets to try and stay warm. The situation was becoming desperate. Ian could feel the chill sinking deep into his bones, and Sirena, though better at handling the cold, seemed affected by it as well. Her glowing skin was dimming, and she seemed unusually still. "We need to keep each other warm," Ian said, his voice low but urgent. Sirena didn't reply, but she moved closer to him. She was no longer the distant, proud alien queen from the ship. She had become something else, something that was struggling to survive just like him. There was no time for pride now, only survival. Ian pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as they sat beside the fire. The heat from their bodies combined with the warmth of the fire began to push back the cold, but it wasn't enough. Ian could feel his own exhaustion starting to take over. The storm outside was unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was relentless, unforgiving. Sirena's breath was slow and steady against his chest, and as they sat together, Ian couldn't help but notice the way their bodies were aligned, the way she seemed to fit against him. He tried to push the thoughts out of his mind. They were just trying to survive. That was all that mattered now. But there was something about the way her body reacted to his, something that seemed to grow stronger the longer they stayed close. The warmth between them was becoming more than just physical. There was a connection forming that neither of them had expected. Neither of them knew what it meant, but it was undeniable. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cave, Ian and Sirena were together, alone, but not truly alone. As the hours passed and the wind howled through the cave, they both found themselves drawn closer to each other. Survival had turned into something deeper, something neither of them fully understood. The storm raged for hours, the wind howling as it slammed against the cave's fragile walls. The cold was intense, and despite the fire flickering weakly in the center of the cave, the temperature inside felt as though it was dropping again. Ian had never experienced anything like this before. The isolation, the cold, and the pressure of survival. It was all wearing on him. But the strangest part was the presence of Sirena beside him. They had spent the past few days huddled close to the fire, doing everything they could to stay warm. The physical closeness was necessary, but it was more than that now. They were starting to rely on each other in ways neither could explain. The unspoken bond between them was growing stronger. Sirena had been silent for a long time, her violet eyes focused on the fire. Her skin, usually glowing softly, had dimmed over the past few hours, her body exhausted from the cold. Ian noticed the way she looked at him from time to time, as if she was trying to understand something that was beyond her. The pull between them was hard to ignore. He could feel it too, this strange, growing connection, but he didn't know what to make of it. Sirena shifted beside him, her body pressing a little closer, seeking warmth. Ian could feel the heat from her body, the soft glow of her skin brushing against his. She had become more human in some ways. Her alien pride had faded, replaced by the simple need for warmth and survival. They were both just trying to make it through. "How much longer do you think the storm will last?" Ian asked, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse from the cold, but he tried to keep it steady. Sirena's eyes flickered briefly toward him. She hesitated before answering, her voice soft, almost uncertain. "I do not know, but it will pass. We must endure." Ian nodded, grateful for her calm presence. She had a way of speaking that brought a sense of assurance, even in the midst of a terrifying situation. He had learned to trust her instincts. She knew how to survive in this world better than he did. Still, as they sat there in the quiet, the tension between them seemed to grow. The storm outside was a constant reminder of their isolation, but it wasn't just the cold that kept them together now. The fire between them, the heat of their bodies sharing space, the subtle glances they exchanged. It was undeniable. Something was shifting between them, something that neither of them could ignore. Ian shifted uncomfortably, his thoughts racing. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had always been a man of logic, focused on the task at hand. But with Sirena, everything seemed to blur. She wasn't just an alien. She wasn't just a survivor. There was something about her that made him feel connected to her in a way he couldn't explain. But Sirena was no different. She had never known the emotions Ian was experiencing. Her species didn't have the same connections, the same understanding of love or affection. To her, the closeness between them was something entirely new. But as the hours passed, she began to feel something she couldn't push away. The need for warmth had turned into something more. The heat she craved was no longer just from the fire. It was from him. Their bodies were close, and every breath she took seemed to match his. The warmth between them grew, not just from their proximity, but from something else. Sirena didn't fully understand it, but she could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just the need for survival anymore. It was something else, something deeper. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Why are you so calm?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "In the face of this storm, you do not seem afraid." Ian looked at her, surprised by the question. "I guess it's because I have to be calm. If I panic, then I can't help you. I can't help us." Sirena studied his face, her violet eyes searching for meaning in his words. "And yet you are not like other humans." Ian didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't sure what she meant, but he could feel the weight of her gaze on him. Her eyes were intense, and there was something about her that seemed to understand him more than he understood himself. "We're not that different," Ian finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't know where the words came from, but they felt right. "We both just want to survive." Sirena didn't speak, but she moved a little closer to him. For a moment, neither of them said anything, but the closeness between them spoke volumes. The storm outside was still raging, but inside the cave, something was shifting. The need for warmth had turned into something else. Neither of them knew how to handle it, but they both felt it growing stronger. In that silence, as they sat side by side, they were no longer just two beings trying to survive. They were something more, a strange, unspoken connection that neither of them could deny. The storm had lasted for 3 full days, and now, as the winds finally began to die down, Ian and Sirena were left in an uneasy silence. The snow outside had piled up, burying the cave entrance, but the worst of the cold seemed to have passed. The fire, though weak from the lack of fuel, still crackled in the center of the cave, offering a small but welcome warmth. Ian's muscles ached from the constant tension. His body had been fighting to survive the storm, and now, as the weather cleared, he found himself fighting something else. His feelings toward Sirena. The bond between them had grown deeper than he ever imagined. The physical warmth they shared had become more than just a necessity. There was an emotional pull now, an attraction neither of them could deny. Sirena seemed to be feeling it too. She was no longer the distant, aloof alien queen she had been when they first met. She had changed in ways Ian hadn't expected. She was more human now, vulnerable, connected. And though she still didn't understand emotions the way humans did, she couldn't ignore the closeness between them. The pull to be near him, to share warmth, was something more than just survival. "Ian," Sirena spoke, breaking the silence that had hung between them for hours. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made Ian look up from his thoughts. "Yes." He wasn't sure what to expect from her, but the way she said his name made him uneasy. She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the entrance, then back at him. "I do not understand this feeling." Ian felt his heart race. He knew what she meant. He could feel the same thing, but he didn't know how to explain it. He had tried to push it away, telling himself they were just trying to survive. But the truth was, it wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something more. "I think I know what you mean," Ian said softly. "It's hard to explain. I've never felt like this before." Sirena looked at him, her violet eyes searching his face. "I am not supposed to feel this way. My people do not feel attachment. But with you, it is different." Ian swallowed hard. He could feel the heat of her gaze on him, and it sent a strange shiver down his spine. The tension in the air was thick, and as much as he wanted to push it away, he couldn't ignore it. The storm had brought them closer together, but now the storm inside him was harder to ignore. "We're not so different," Ian said quietly. He reached out, gently brushing his hand against hers. Her skin was still warm, though not as warm as his own, and the touch sent an unexpected surge of energy through him. "We both want to survive. We both need each other." Sirena didn't pull away. Instead, She slowly closed the gap between them. Her body shifted closer, and she leaned in, her breath warm against his skin. She didn't fully understand what she was doing, but her instincts were guiding her in a way she couldn't deny. Then, Sirena whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "What are we to each other?" Ian's mind raced. The question seemed simple, but the answer was anything but. They were allies, yes, survivors in this harsh, frozen world. But there was more now. Much more. "I don't know," Ian admitted. "But I can't keep pretending I don't feel it." Sirena studied him, her expression unreadable. She had never been this close to another being before. Not like this. Her world didn't have relationships or affection the way humans did. But with Ian, it was different. She didn't understand it, but she felt it. She felt the heat that sparked between them, the connection that neither of them had chosen, but could no longer deny. The moment stretched on, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, Sirena reached out and placed her hand against Ian's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was so different from the cold, distant heart of her own people. It was warm, alive. "Ian," she whispered again, her voice stronger now. "I need you." The words, simple as they were, sent a jolt of realization through Ian. He had known, deep down, that this connection was growing stronger. But hearing her say it out loud, he couldn't deny it any longer. He pulled her closer, his hands resting on her shoulders, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. It wasn't just for survival anymore. They were no longer just two beings fighting against the cold. The bond between them had become something else, something he didn't fully understand, but something he wanted to explore. "I need you too, Sirena," Ian murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "But we can't let this distract us. We still have to survive." Sirena nodded, understanding the weight of his words. They couldn't afford to lose focus. Not yet. But the truth was, they had already crossed a line. Whatever this was, it had become more than just a matter of survival. It was a choice they would have to make together. As the fire crackled softly in the cave, the world outside remained cold and unforgiving. But inside, in that small, sheltered space, Ian and Sirena found warmth not just from the fire, but from each other. Their journey together was far from over, and the choices they would make in the coming days would change everything. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world that was still buried in snow. The sun, though hidden behind thick clouds, cast a pale light over the icy landscape. The air outside was still cold, but the worst was over. The cave, though small, had become a refuge, a place where Ian and Sirena had learned to survive together. And now, as they stood at the mouth of the cave, the bond between them had become undeniable. Ian looked at Sirena, his eyes searching hers. The connection between them was stronger than ever. They had spent days together, struggling against the cold, sharing warmth, and sharing something deeper that neither of them fully understood. But in that moment, they both knew they had crossed a line. They had become more than just survivors. They had become something else, partners, companions, even if the future was uncertain. Sirena looked back at him, her violet eyes soft. She had never felt like this before. Her people didn't form attachments. They didn't need each other like this. But Ian had shown her a different way of being, a way that made her feel more human than she had ever felt before. The warmth between them, the way their bodies sought each other, it wasn't just survival anymore. It was something more, something real. "We can't stay here forever," Ian said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of uncertainty. The cave had been their shelter, but it couldn't protect them from everything. The planet was harsh, and they needed to find a way off it. "I know," Sirena replied softly. "But for now, we must go on." Ian nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape outside. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind still cut through the air, biting with cold. They would need to find more supplies, food, shelter, and eventually a way to contact their people. But for now, they had each other. The fire in the cave had long since died out, and their bodies had cooled from the heat they had shared. They were both tired, but there was something in the air now. The tension between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional. They were learning to trust each other in ways they hadn't before. And that trust was something they would need if they were going to survive. Sirana stepped closer to Lion, her hand reaching for his. She didn't speak, but the gesture was enough. It was a silent promise, a commitment to whatever came next. Whatever challenges they would face them together. Ian took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We'll make it," he said, his voice steady. "We'll get through this. Together." Sirana's lips curled into a small smile, the first real smile he had seen from her in days. It was a smile that spoke of hope, of something beyond just survival. It was a smile that said she believed in them. "We will," she agreed. Together, they left the cave, stepping into the bitter cold of the planet's surface. The landscape around them was desolate, the horizon stretching out in all directions. But as they walked side by side, their hearts felt lighter. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for sure: they would face it together. The harsh conditions of the planet hadn't broken them. If anything, it had brought them closer. And as they'd made their way toward the distant mountains, their bond was unbreakable. There would be dangers ahead. There would be hardships, challenges, and maybe even more storms to weather. But Ian and Sirana were ready for whatever came next. For the first time since they had crash-landed on this frozen world, they felt a sense of purpose. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by fate. They were partners, allies, and perhaps even something more. The path ahead was unclear, but together, they would walk it, step by step, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future held. They had survived the storm, and now they would survive whatever came next. The journey had only just begun.